Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back or welcome to my podcast, Rewire to Inspire. I'm your host, Jessie Brown, and I am very excited to be jumping on the microphone with you all for episode number 203. If you missed my last episode, number 202, we talked about why self-love is essential for growth. So if you love all things self-love, if you love learning about growth, and even more so, if you want to learn about self-love and growth together and how they complement each other and how, we kind of need to have one to optimize the other, that is definitely the episode for you. For today's episode, number 203, you guys, I am so excited to be talking about this concept. And if you've clicked this episode, you already know the title. We are talking about the compound of mental health. If you guys have been long-term listeners of this show, you guys have definitely heard me talk about the book, The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. I have it behind me. It is under this plant here if you're watching video. If not, it is behind me on my shelf. It is one of my all-time favorite books. I have probably read it at least 3 times. It's a quick read, but it is one of the most powerful, fundamental concepts that we as human beings really should understand. And it is really the preface that everything that we do in life has a byproduct. And similarly to money and our health and growth, our mental health has a compound effect, meaning that there is a trickle effect that can happen. And the longer that we push our healing and facing our traumas and working on ourselves, the harder it becomes, but also the worse it can become, the more detrimental it can become. And so it's really understanding that everything in life is kind of a byproduct of something else. And the whole concept of the compound effect is that over time, things will continue to increase. And so the other day when I was out for my walk, which is where a lot of my ideas have been coming from lately, which I cannot recommend just going for a walk and disconnecting more. It is so good for your mental health. It is so good for your well-being. It's so good to de-stress because you can just be present. You're outside, you're in the sun, and it allows you to be creative. We have such creative blocks when we are just looking at our phones all the time and have that constant stimuli, and we're not actually thinking for ourselves. And so when we go for a walk and we're actually present and in the world and looking around, it's crazy the things that can happen. And so I started thinking specifically about the book, The Compound Effect, because I was thinking about money and investing and just all these different areas. And as someone who has pretty complex ADHD, my brain just goes a million freaking miles a second. And I just was like, all these ideas, thinking of the compound effect. And then I'm like, oh my God, how have I never talked about the compound effect of our mental health? And so I felt pulled, curious, excited, optimistic to come on here and talk about that and what I mean by that and why it's so important that we deal with our mental health, because when we don't, that is affecting us in other areas of our life. That is going to pour out in other areas of our life, and that is going to stay with us. The thing about our mental health, I don't care if you are black, white, yellow, orange, purple, green. I don't care if you identify as a tree. I don't care what you are. If you are a human being and you have a brain and you have a heart, you have mental health. And some of our mental health is better than others, but we all have mental health. The same as we just have general health that we talk about. For some reason, we're like, oh, only some people suffer with mental health. It's like, no, we all have quote unquote mental health. We all just have different severities of traumas and, different disorders that we deal with and experiences, et cetera, et cetera. But mental health is something we all have. It affects all of us. And so knowing that different experiences can impact us differently, but even just frontline saying, hey, we all deal with this, means that in some ways, it is very, very crucial that we realize the same as our health. If we think about just our general health, we know that if we eat poorly, we don't exercise, we don't optimize our sleep, we're surrounded by negative, toxic people, that's also going to compound into a, pretty unhealthy version of yourself. Well, the same rings true with our mental health, but we don't really talk about that or realize the implications that can come from not dealing with things in the world of our mental health. And so I wanted to talk about some reasons why we avoid as a society working on our mental health, because I think that the reason that we don't realize these things or talk about these things is because we aren't aware that we're not alone in these reasons. And I sat there and I was like trying to think of 5 reasons of why we avoid working on our mental health, and I thought of them like very quickly. Under 30 seconds I had all of these because they're so common. And so the first reason that we don't really work on our mental health is because we don't really believe that we have mental health or that it can get better, right? And so if we're already like naive to the fact that mental health affects us, we're never going to think that we need to work on it. But if we also think that it can never get better, we're also not going to work on it. So we're basically just being naive that it exists, we suppress it, we pretend it's not there, and so then we don't have to face it. The second reason is denial of how it's affecting you. You're not going to deal with something if you're in denial about how it's affecting you. We see this all the time in chronic addictions. We see this with health. If you don't think that your, alcohol consumption is affecting you and that it's time to maybe get some help, if you're in denial about that, you're not going to get help. That's why we say, when I was doing a little bit of work in addictions and recovery, the only way that we can help someone is when they are ready. If they're still in the denial stage, nothing is going to progress. Nothing's going to kind of come from it because you're not going to do the work. And the same rings true with mental health. If you're in denial about it, you're not going to do the necessary actions that are required to improve your mental health. The third is shame around it. This one is probably one of the most common ones because we've been told our whole life, specifically men, that if you suffer with your mental health, you are less than, you are weak, you are, not a man or whatever, like just pull up your boots and get to work, like suck it up kind of thing. And it's like that creates and has created so much shame in our society. And also, depending on the things that we've been through, we might feel shameful to talk about them. We might feel shameful to bring them up or to admit those things to ourselves, which brings me to number 4, scared to revisit our past. If you have a past that has a lot of trauma in it and a lot of pain and stuff that you're shameful about, or rightfully so, scared to bring back up to the surface, of course you're not going to work on it. And number 5 is past negative experiences, maybe working on your mental health. So let's say you've seen a mental health professional in the past, you've worked with a therapist, and it just didn't go great. Maybe you weren't paired with someone that was a good fit, or maybe you just had a negative experience. Maybe you brought up stuff too quickly and it overwhelmed you. Whatever it is, those are just 5 such common ways and reasons why we don't deal with our mental health. I think that it's important that we talk about those reasons, but that we also talk about the difference between somebody who has and is willing to do the work and somebody who is not. And so I kind of wanted to talk about 2 different scenarios. And I brought this idea up because the same is in the compound effect, where they talk about, one friend who was saving money and who was exercising consistently and doing these things versus another friend who wasn't as consistent and was just like kind of, doing it when he wanted to. The compound of that over time was astronomically different. That one friend that was consistent was way up here on the graph and the other one was way down here. But you don't see those changes day to day. You see those changes typically year to year. The same rings true with our mental health. We don't really realize that putting in the work slowly, even if it seems insignificant every day, is going to propel us so much farther than if we're just naive and neglectful and in denial about how it's affecting us. So I thought about doing, just like 2 different individuals, but I was like, I'm going to do this example in regards to siblings, because I think if I say siblings, it's a lot closely tied to maybe having somewhat of a similar upbringing. And just as anytime I talk about trauma, just because 2 people went through the same experience does not mean that it impacted them the same way. So even though I'm talking about 2 siblings in this example, it also does not mean that the experiences that they went through, affected them the same. I think of just even me and my brother. We grew up in the same household, but I know that how things affected him versus how they affected me were completely different. But I wanted to just use this example. So let's say sibling 1. I'm just going to call them 1 and 2 because it's easier than me trying to remember a name. So sibling 1, they go to therapy. They are facing the past. They're doing the intergenerational work. They are showing up. They're getting uncomfortable. They're doing the hard stuff and bringing stuff up and learning coping strategies and is aware how trauma is affecting their life. They are learning, the education behind trauma, and they're starting to implement different strategies and things to improve the relationships in their life. They maybe start to, improve their physical health and, maybe start to eat better and go to the gym and just nourish their body, are becoming aware of the impacts of toxic things on themselves and are building resilience and just slowly improving day in and day out, even though it doesn't feel like it, even though it, feels hard, but they are just slowly doing the things to try to regulate their nervous system and their sleep and just trying their best to walk on the path of dealing with their mental health. Let's say sibling 2. So this is basically like your yin and yang. So basically the opposite of all that stuff is maybe in denial that they need help, is maybe struggles to talk about vulnerable things, suppresses emotions, is living in an active state of fight or flight, which in and of itself can cause us to be, in denial and very protective and very closed off and aggressive, right? Protective of our emotions. We feel the need to defend whenever somebody says anything, is unaware of how experiences in their life have maybe impacted them. But deeper than that, the education of the biology of that and how that's affected their brain and their body and their digestion and their sleep and all these things. And so also with that one, their window of tolerance becomes smaller, and with sibling 1, their window of tolerance would have increased. So it's bigger, they have more resilience. And so you can see that even just with these 2 examples, I'm going to just switch my page here. If you've noticed me glancing, I have a couple little notes there. But even just with these 2 examples, sibling 1, the compound of that, even though there's still going to be hard days, there is still going to be challenges in life, there's still going to be adversity that they have to face, there's still going to be all these things, they have the tools in their backpack, right? They've begun to empty a little bit out of the glass. They're building a little bit of resiliency, because depending how full your glass is, aka how much you've gone through in life and how much trauma you have, it's really hard to then be susceptible to take on more things later in life. Our cup is full, it's maxed, it's capped. We can't put on anything else without blowing up or finding a way to cope with it because it's just too much. And so one of the positive effects of, dealing with our mental health and the compound of that is creating space. It's creating resilience. It's allowing you to take on more in life without it overwhelming you. That is quite literally the work of phase 1 trauma healing, is widening your window of tolerance. To widen your window of tolerance allows you to feel grounded. It allows you to feel safe in your body. It allows your nervous system to come back to its rest and digest state, right? That parasympathetic state. It allows us to optimize our sleep. It allows us to not be in that chronic stress response, right? Which is affecting our body. Whereas if we look at sibling 2, they are stuck in their body. Their nervous system is stuck in fight or flight. They have not taken anything out of their cup. That means everything that comes their way is just going to feel like too much. They're going to feel like that's a very individualized experience and no one will understand. No one will be able to relate. Oftentimes when we have all that trauma and the compound of that mental health on us, makes us really angry when people, point out these things for us. It can really start to affect our health, meaning we can get sick easier. We can be easier to snap at those that we love. We might have a harder time concentrating. We might have a harder time sleeping. We might begin to gain weight in certain places, specifically the lower stomach, because our body isn't doing the things that it needs to do to break down that fat, but it's also storing it because it feels like it has to in that survival state. Right? You can be more susceptible to anxiety, to depression, to have heart attacks at young ages, to have high blood pressure, heart disease, all these things, because your body's working twice as hard because it thinks that it's still in an active state of trauma. I know these things sound like so crazy and hyper complex, but the thing about our mental health is, again, it's on a spectrum. But if we do not deal with these things, and typically if you're in denial about your mental health, sorry, this piece of hair here is driving me nuts and I gotta fix it. If you are in denial about your mental health in any way, shape, or form, I would bet that it is because you've undergone some kind of trauma. That would just be my educated guess. Because typically those of us that I've witnessed that don't have complex trauma in their past, it's a lot easier to talk about because there's no protector that comes up. There's no need to like self-defend. But when we've undergone stuff and we're just like naive to it, suppress it, whatever, and we're not aware of the effects of that, we don't know that it's impacting us. And we hear all these health concerns and things that are killing us in the world. And yes, a lot of those things are environmental, are the foods that we're consuming. It is lack of exercise. But the root cause of so much of these things is our mental health. Because again, think of the compound of that. Think of the trickle effect. If we are depressed, if we are anxious, if we're overwhelmed, if we're all these things, we're probably not going to feel worthy to go to the gym. It's also exhausting. So we're not going to have the energy to move our body. We're not going to have the energy to think of highly nutritious, good foods. We're not going to feel like we're worthy of eating that. Maybe, you have so much brain fog and depression and anxiety that you could never go to college, so you could never get a good paying job. And I'm not saying that's the only route to get a good paying job, but just very surface level. All these things have a trickle effect. And that is really what I'm trying to bring home with this episode is our mental health will have a byproduct effect to it. Whether we realize that directly or indirectly, it is happening whether we realize it or not. Think about the days that you even wake up in a quote unquote bad mood. You already look at the world differently. You're already like, oh, frig this, and like, oh, like everything's going wrong and all traffic sucks. And you're already just so like uptight and frustrated. It's like, imagine that being your reality all the time and not realizing that that is actually impacting you severely. I mean, you get so accustomed to living that way. And I know this because this used to be how I lived before I started to do the work. I wasn't realizing that everything that was around me was created based off of how I viewed myself, how I was treating myself, what I was tolerating to be in my circle, but how all of that was implicated and dictated because of my mental health. It wasn't until I started seeing a therapist and, studying social work and learning about psychoeducation, learning about trauma in the brain and the body. And there's a reason that I'm so passionate about talking about these things, because I understand what it's like to be on both sides of this. And it's so frustrating when I look at our world and I just see so many hurt people that are just so unaware of the impacts of how their unresolved pain is affecting them. But the thing about healing is we cannot force it on anybody. We can encourage and we can love and we can educate. But the same as you cannot bring someone to rehab that is in denial, you can't just drop someone off at therapy and say, pick you up in an hour. They have to be ready and willing to do the work. And if you listening are listening to this episode, I highly doubt that you are that person, but that doesn't mean that you've necessarily gone to therapy. That doesn't mean necessarily that you're fully optimizing looking after your mental health and, the implications things have had on your life. But I would bet that if you're listening to this, you're a little farther along than you might realize or be validating for yourself. But I just want you to know that there will never be a time when you are ready. There will never be a time when therapy is like fun. And I mean, I think therapy is fun. And I think, I really enjoyed being on the other side of it, of, getting to talk to folks. But it's never going to be like, that was so much fun. But it can begin to be enjoyable, because hopefully the goal is that you're going to start to feel better. But a lot of times it starts to feel worse before it feels better. And I used to say to clients, it's like climbing up a mountain, and as you go up, it's going to get steeper and it's going to get steeper, and that backpack's going to get heavier. And there's going to be a point when you reach the summit where you're like, oh my God, this is too much. And then it starts to become a little bit easier. And then another mountain comes and we get to climb it again. And that is just the process of healing. But what I can say is that going to therapy, facing your mental health, and working on this doesn't have any negative sides to it. Yes, it can be uncomfortable, and I encourage you to do it in a safe way and with someone that you trust and that you feel in alignment with and feel safe to open up about these things with. But it's never going to hurt you to work on your mental health. It's never going to cause more harm to heal the things in your past and to just have tools to optimize your mental health. And I know that it's not easy, and I know that it's not the funnest thing in the whole wide world. But I can promise you that it's worth it, and I can promise you that by not doing it and not facing it, it does have a compound effect. And that is affecting you, and that will affect you for the rest of your life. Just because it has become your normal doesn't mean that it has to be your normal forever. I don't care if you are 10, 20, 40, 60, 90 listening to this. You are never fully stuck. Your mind never stops changing. Neuroplasticity does not expire. We hear your brain does not stop fundamentally developing until 25. But that doesn't mean that then what you know is all you know, or that you can't change your thought patterns. That is a very, very big myth in neuroscience and just in the world. Our brain is so susceptible and open and resilient to change. I just talked to my grandmother today who had a stroke several years ago about how she's now doing these little memory things because she heard that it helps with her brain. And I'm like, girl, you are in your 70s and you're still working on your brain, and this is why you're the best. But that just shows, and that made me so happy because I'm like, yes, you don't believe that you are just stuck like this and you can improve. But the only times that we don't improve and we make ourselves stuck and put ourselves in a box is when we don't think that it can get better. You might think that just because your life right now is the way that it is, that's all that will ever be possible. And maybe you're just tired of being exhausted and cranky and overwhelmed and having no capacity left to enjoy life. And if that's you, it can get better. And all you can do is work on that and trust that those around you will love and support you through that. And the fact that you're choosing to work on yourself is already just such a beautiful thing. And so I hope that you give yourself a pat on the back and thank yourself for being willing to do something that a lot of people don't do. But in conclusion, just know your mental health is a compound effect, and it is affecting you. Would you rather that compound be for your benefit in a positive direction, or be something that continues to hold you back and to affect your health in a negative way? So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. When you're listening to this episode, the next day will be Valentine's Day. So happy Love Day. I'm sending you guys all the love, and I am so excited to look forward. Yes, I am so looking forward to chatting with you all on Thursday. And I hope that you just take a second to just validate how this sits with you. Maybe anybody in your life that you're like, oh gosh, I really want them to get this message. Send them this message, send them this podcast, and just say, hey, I listened to this and I thought that it was kind of cool, and I just wondered your thoughts on it. And it just allows a conversation to open. These things aren't always rushed or need to be pushed, but they can just open the door for conversation. That is really my goal. So thank you guys so much. I'm sending you all the love, and I will chat with you all soon. Bye, you guys.